Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Modern Maker Podcast. I am Mathew Gnagy, and this is...
I'm Yannick Prüser.
And today we are going to be talking about a long-awaited garment for all of you, which is Pluderhosen. Yannick has examined a pair at the museum in Hanover and has some really interesting things to say, some fantastic photographs. And this is something I don't think many people in the world have actually seen. So us putting a podcast out about it could be kind of a big deal. And I think you all should have fun watching it. Anyway, without further ado, let's get rolling on it. So Yannick, tell me about kind of how you got involved in this project and what it's about, and like tell me about the world of these Pluderhosen, because I think everybody would really like to know. Since they're not anything that's in like patterns of fashion, they haven't been, published by the British school, right? You're German, they are a German garment. I think that we should really get your perspective on it.
Yeah, I think the main problem is that even though it's a pretty interesting garment, there's just no chance to get any info about it. Like, I didn't know about them for a long time. Like, even after my work with the museum started, I didn't know about them for like several months. And it was just a coincidence, just luck, that I saw photos of them, old black and white photos. And I immediately assumed that these photos were pretty old and that the garments were no longer in existence. And I asked the museum about it, and they told me that there's like a hidden collection of late 16th century men's garments inside the museum that basically nobody has heard about. So it's actually, I think, 9 garments in total, all from one person or one household, we can't be sure. And all of these garments are fantastic. Not all are in a fantastic condition, like some of them look pretty bad by now, but yeah, there's basically a little treasure hidden in the vaults of the Hanover Museum. And I asked them if there was a chance to look at the garments, or at least at the Pluderhosen. And after some time, I actually got the chance and the permission to look at one pair of Pluderhosen from the collection, the only one that has its original state to a certain extent, at least. So yeah, it was kind of coincidence that I discovered this collection and got the chance to look at them.
Well, what a lucky coincidence. And I think the rest of us will feel very lucky that you had that coincidence, because the things that we're going to look at are pretty amazing. These Pluderhosen are one piece of many. Can you just give us an overview of like the grouping of clothes and kind of what these Pluderhosen represent?
There might have been more garments in this collection originally. We don't know. We don't have many sources yet. Like there might be something hidden, like additional info, like perhaps written evidence or something like that. But just now we don't know that much. We don't even know who the original owner of these clothes was. There's a theory that these clothes were once worn by Erich II, an uncle of Moritz, the guy whose clothes we are examining right now. And he gave these clothes, or he might have given these clothes to the city of Einbeck at some point in the 1570s or 80s. And that's why the collection is called the Einbeck collection, because this is where the clothes come from. Like, we don't know if they were made there, but the collection is still named that way. And we have 3 Pluderhosen, 2 breeches. You could call them Venetians, so smooth at the knee. Classical style, basically. 2 doublets and 1 waistcoat or sleeveless doublet. And what's really fascinating about this is that the doublets all have hip rolls or remnants of hip rolls. So it's a very specific style of garments, basically, and it's very rare to get garments from this specific late 16th century context, I think, because they're so odd. They're unlike anything I've seen so far.
Well, and I'm super excited about the hip rolls being on them because, in my work, I keep talking about you have to have a hip roll if you want your breeches to have the right silhouette. The thing that I think is so funny is that I just don't associate that silhouette as much with German clothing, and yet they're the only extant pieces that seem to have surviving hip rolls attached to the doublets. So it's fascinating to me, and maybe they survive because the Germans attached them to the doublet, but other countries attached them somewhere else or kept them separate. Who even knows why? I mean, we know that they were wearing them because the paintings tell us that, but now we have proof of one of the ways in which that was utilized, and I think that's really exciting. So let's sort of home in a little bit more on the Pluderhosen. I think the rest of the collection sounds absolutely fascinating, and I am looking forward to hearing more about it as we get closer to examining it. But the Pluderhosen are something that you've actually handled and can speak to sort of the experience of working with them and measuring them and understanding what they are and some of the more interesting, unique aspects of how they're made. I mean, you and I have had conversations about these Pluderhosen for months,
Yes.
and I'm so excited that we're able to tell the public about it. So I'm just going to say to the public, like, I'm super sorry if there's some coded speech between the two of us because we've just worked together on this for so long, but we'll do our best to make sure that you're included in the conversation.
So handling the Pluderhosen actually wasn't that easy. Not only because it's a massive garment, like there's a lot of fabric, it's old and fragile, you can't just throw it around, you have to be careful, but also because the Pluderhosen are toxic right now. You can't handle them without protective clothing.
Can
Yes.
you explain to the audience why they're toxic? Like, tell us about like what the process was that now like they can't be touched.
As far as I know, like I think that we don't even know for sure, but at some point somebody sprayed some anti-insect spray on them or like coated all of the garments in some sort of substance to prevent them from being eaten by insects or other animals. So that person had good intentions, but as far as we know, it's not safe to touch or breathe basically close to the Pluderhosen without protective gear. And the room in which were we examining the Pluderhosen is pretty old and is also not safe to move in without protective clothing because of some substances built into the floor. So the room was toxic and the Pluderhosen were toxic. So we had to wear a lot of protective gear. And yeah, that made it a little bit complicated.
Wow.
Yeah, but it was fun nonetheless. Like when we opened the box, like there was a big box where the Pluderhosen were stored in. We didn't really were able to see anything except of a large mountain of fabric, basically, and you couldn't really see specific places. Like we were looking at the backside of the Pluderhosen, but we didn't notice until like 5 minutes into the examination because like I was wondering where's the codpiece? There should be codpiece on there, and it was, but on the backside, and we were looking at the wrong side. Yeah, but it was hard to see because it's so much fabric. And that was basically the reason why I wanted to look at this specific pair, because as I said, there are 3 Pluderhosen in total, and 2 of the Pluderhosen are in a horrible state. Like the outer shell is still intact, like the paints and the codpiece and everything, but somebody ripped out all of the silk at some point. Like removed the silk from the codpiece, from between the paints, everything is gone. And we don't know who did this. It might have happened in the 19th century or even earlier, because the museum actually prepared fake silk for the breeches to be presented to the public. And that already happened in the 19th century. So they must have been damaged even before that. So there's a long history of treating these garments pretty bad. And this is the only garment, or at least the only pair of Pluderhosen that survived, which with its original silk bags hanging out between the paints. So this is the reason why I wanted to look at this specific pair of Pluderhosen.
Gotcha. So that makes these pretty special then, that the silk is still intact and the whole pair is doing exactly what it's meant to. And some of the things that we've talked about, just examining the insides of them after your trip to the museum, there's just some fascinating efficiencies in the construction and just understanding the way that they're cut. I think it's really, really fun. So Let's continue our exploration of your experience in examining them, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into how they're made.
Yeah.
So you
So
told the box, there's a giant pile of fabric.
yeah,
And what happened next?
I think what's important to know is that these Pluderhosen are basically all silk bags. Like there are paints, but these paints are very, very thin, like I think 3.5 centimeters. So they kind of disappear. So even when you take the Pluderhosen out of the box and basically spread them a little bit so it can have a better look, it's like 90% silk bags that you can see. And we were kind of like lifting everything up and looking at the hidden details. And after some time, we had some basic understanding on how these were constructed. Because as you already said, it's like, I try not to say that it's simple, because these breeches are not simple. They're pretty complicated. But compared to other extant Pluderhosen, like the Stube garments, for example, they are a bit more simplistic. So are they simple? No. But are they simpler than other garments of that type? Yes. It's really straightforward, basically. You have a waistband that's actually sitting on top of the natural waist. So they're sitting pretty high for Pluderhosen. Then you have an upper row of loops, of looped paints, basically. Then another band going around the hips. So kind of like the waistband. And from then on to the knee band, you have the lower row of paints. So 2 rows of paints connected by the waistband, the hip band, and then a knee band that sits above the knee. So that's basically the construction. Does that make sense?
It sounds so simple when you say it that way, but when we get into the detail of it, I think the audience is going to see that they are definitely not simple. I think that once we understand the order of operations and how they're supposed to function, that the construction will not be complicated, but simple, I think is definitely a word to avoid. I think they'll still take a lot of skill to do well.
Definitely. And they were made by a skilled tailor. You can see this. But you can see that these Pluderhosen are not so much about the paints, but all about the intricate design of the silk, for example.
There's some complicated seamings in the silk poofs to get them to hang the way that they hang. And I think that is a really important element for the audience to understand, is that there's a lot of controlling the angle of the drape of the silk, specifically by seaming the silk a certain way, and then interior structures that we may not necessarily think of right off the bat. And just for the American audience that may not be as familiar with the metric system, 3.5 centimeters for a pane is about 1 3/8 inches wide. So consider that, how narrow that is in comparison to patterns of fashion with the Pluderhosen and the width of those panes being so substantial. This, in contrast, is quite thin and almost invisible once all of the poofs are in place.
Yeah. Also, if you look at the way the silk between the panes is gathered in the Sture Pluderhosen, you have these little stay tapes and the silk is gathered to them, and then they basically hang out slightly gathered between these panes. So they are structured, but the silhouette is a little bit different than what we have here in the Einbeck collection, because the Einbeck Pluderhosen, or at least the example I was looking at, it's pretty round. So they're not just hanging down the body, but they're actually like the poof is standing out. It almost has a trunk hose shape. Like not exactly, it's not as round, of course, because the paints are just hanging down flat against the body, but it's a massive pair of breeches when worn. Like it's a look. And so I think it's definitely another style of Pluderhosen. I think a later style, and with another silhouette, and that's the reason for the different treatment of the silk, basically. My theory. I can't prove it.
Well, I mean, it's a good theory, and we can't really ever know, but we do have to make some assumptions at some point that we can work with in order to reproduce them and try to make them look real, right?
Yeah.
So Now that they're out of the box and they're on the table and you're starting to examine them, where's the first place that you look?
The first place we looked was the center back seam, because as I already said, it was laying with the backside pointing towards us. So this was logically the first place where we started to look. And we noticed pretty early on that somebody had ripped open the center back seam at some point. And this is why we basically thought that we were looking at the front, because we mistook the backside for, a front opening. We thought, oh, this is the front opening of the breeches, but it was just the heavily damaged backside, the center back seam. And I mean, it's pretty clear why that happened. Like at some point, somebody in the museum wanted to present these Pluderhosen on a mannequin. So they ripped open the seam to like get it onto the mannequin. So that was the plan, I assume. And because this is a pretty solid area, like there are many layers in that place, they just ripped everything open, I think with some force, because it wasn't that easy. So that is in a pretty bad state. It looks pretty rough. And that's why it was also pretty hard to like examine everything, because it was so destroyed.
Hmm.
Um,
That's
but
really
that is,
unfortunate.
yeah, but most of the breaches are intact. Like this is already the heaviest damage done to the breaches. I don't know why this pair is in such a good condition compared to the other two Pluderhosen. Like, why wasn't the silk removed? Um, we will never know, I think, or perhaps at some point. But so far, yeah, I'm just lucky that so little damage was done compared to the other Pluderhosen.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then we were basically, after we were finished with the backside of the Pluderhosen, like taking a first look at the paints, looking how were the paints lined, for example, which was done with wool, which is also not that, it wasn't expected. Like I didn't expect it. It's just one layer of silk, and that is basically faced with one layer of wool. This is how the paints are made. Pretty simple, just one row of stitches to connect them. No complicated work. Like that is pretty simple, the way they did the paints. And one thing that was pretty hard for us from the beginning was like deciding what color are these Pluderhosen, because they look brownish,
Right.
blackish.
Archaeological brown.
Yeah. And the only thing you can really see is that the paints were darker originally than the silk between the paints. So I personally, but that is just my opinion, I can't prove that, I'm not an expert on dyeing fabrics, is that the paints were black originally, and the silk between the paints was olive green. And that the olive green fabric darkened over time, the black lightened over time. So both are now a little bit brownish, because almost all other garments in this collection are either black or olive green or both. So whoever owned these garments had a specific taste in color. And I personally assume that this also extended to the Pluderhosen. Also because the other two pairs of Pluderhosen are also made from olive green silk, at least the paints are. So it might have looked like that originally, but it's hard to tell without proper examination.
Right. Well, I'm going to run with that colorway when I do my sample, and if you do your sample in the same way, when we're analyzing the pattern in terms of actually applying it, making one in your size and making one in my size and comparing the two together in terms of how do they look, how do they compare to history, and we'll each probably have our different shades of black and green. So I think it's going to be a really interesting experiment long term.
Yeah, like I think they will look great. Like it's a fantastic silhouette, and you see it quite a lot on pictorial evidence from that time, from the 1580s and 90s especially, like this really dramatic look. And yeah, I'm here for it. So yeah, so we were turning the Pluderhosen around after we were finished with the backside, and yeah, then it basically became pretty interesting, because we were looking at the codpiece, for example, which is massive. in this example, like this is really a big codpiece, and there's also a pretty broad gusset, basically extending from the codpiece between the legs, which is, in my opinion, pretty important for Pluderhosen and hosen in general, to have this gusset under the codpiece to like enabling the wearer to like spread their legs, which is not that easy in breeches so tight. So it was cool seeing that in this example. And yeah, we also had our first look in the inside of the breeches. And now I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the breeches is that there's not much going on the inside. Like the breeches are mostly unlined. There's a small area around the hips that is lined with a linen fabric. The codpiece is lined. There's a slim leather strip used to line the center back seam and a small linen facing on the center front opening. That's it. Just some scraps of linen. There is no complete lining, and there's also no leather foundation, as you would expect it from the Sture Pluderhosen, for example. Like 2 of these Pluderhosen have an internal leather layer basically holding everything together. Svante Sture's Pluderhosen were worn originally with an extra pair of leather breeches, and these don't have that at all. So they're pretty lightweight, and also they have to be constructed a little bit differently, of course, because you don't have that heavy foundation leather layer.
You mentioned Svante Sture's the separate leather underbreeches that he would wear. I mean, since there's no lining that exists with this pair, one could surmise that that might also be the same if they were worn for colder weather. But if you're wearing them in the heat of the summer, it might be good to have no lining inside them.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but just given the fact that there is leather used in these breeches, like to line the center back seam, it would be kind of weird to basically, at least to me personally, to imagine wearing leather hosen and then having like another piece of layer inside of the a piece of leather inside of the breeches, or like 2 layers of leather at center back.
Well, see, and then this is audience, you will understand this is how Yannick and I discuss these things. Like I'll throw out an idea of what I think and he counters and we kind of find a place in the middle. And so what I'm going to say now is I don't necessarily the leather underbreeches versus the leather stay tape are 2 completely different uses. They're 2 completely different concepts. Like if you've got a piece of leather to keep a seam strong, that has nothing to do with whether you're wearing a separate underbreeches inside it or not. You know, the concept of underbreeches is something that you see in the 17th century. It goes all the way through the 18th century and into the 19th century as something that you do in the wintertime to keep warm. So you have, it's, you know, those underbreeches function more like a removable lining if you consider it in that concept. And I think because this pair of breeches is more contemporary with Svantes, which are an older style compared to the 2 boys that are younger, it makes sense that they would have that similar construction of not a full lining as part of the construction of the breeches themselves, but then they have a separate one to go underneath. The only difference is that they're missing from this pair versus what we have with Svantes.
Yeah, I mean that's the point. Like it would be possible, I think, to wear leather hosen underneath, but
not necessary for the functioning of the breeches, for sure.
Yeah, like there's nothing preventing you from wearing leather hosen underneath. We just have no traces. So it might have happened. Like as you said, I mean, it's not uncommon for that time period to wear hosen under a pair of breeches. Like that's a common concept, and it's possible. I personally would like to believe that these are just made entirely without such a thing, but I mean, I can't prove it. And just because I wanted to be that way, that doesn't mean that it was that way. Like, that's not how it works.
At least you as a researcher admit that out loud. There are some people who just make their assumption and run with it, and they don't ever say that it might not be real, but it's the assumption they're using.
I think it's just so exciting for me, the concept of like having the possibility to work without these leather breeches or leather foundation, because that is what makes making Pluderhosen so complicated for many people, and also for me, because you can't remove the leather layer from the Sture breeches, like from the Sture Pluderhosen, without changing the whole concept of how they work. Like
Right.
it's hard, you can do it, but it changes a lot of things you have to take into consideration. And this was so exciting for me to see, okay, there were Pluderhosen without that, at least to me, complicated inner leather layer, that internal construction. So yeah, it was my own excitement, basically, that led me to this wishful thinking of it, like not having leather under breeches.
I mean, when you consider the temperature differential that you have in Central Europe, right? Like, it makes sense to me that you would build something that doesn't need to have that underlayer, and then you have it if you need it for the cold weather. So, and you see that a lot in the way things are done in the time period. One of the things that is mentioned in Alcega's tailor's manual from 1589 is that a lot of the coats are generally made unlined, but should you want to wear it for winter, you would take it to the furrier to have a fur lining put into it so that you could be warm. And then in spring, summer, you take that lining back out. You take it back to the furrier and they remove the lining so that you can have your garment for the rest of the year. So
Yeah.
this idea of lining not being a permanent structure is definitely present in the time period. It's just, was it part of this pair of Pluderhosen or not? It doesn't really matter because you could do it or not do it. So the thing to consider though is the way that the crotch panel and seat panel in this pair of breeches is made doesn't leave a lot of room for a layer to be worn underneath. And I think that right there is the key element to whether I think a pair of underbreeches could be worn or not. The way the crotch area is built, it fits so tight and snug, and it goes between the butt cheeks, and like it's intense and very close fitting in that very typically German Pluderhosen way. And for lack of better terminology, I like to call it an ass-tastic fit. I hope YouTube doesn't censor the video because I said ass-tastic, but having done a sample of the crotch area, I can tell you that like it doesn't leave a lot of room for something to be worn underneath unless that something is quite soft or also fits that closely, right? So I can be contradicting myself in the same video. Just I was trying to point out that because this pair of breeches might be contemporary with Svante's breeches, the idea that the lining might be separate could be part of just the thinking at the time.
I mean, perhaps we will find some written evidence about this collection at some point, and then we might also know what is missing. And perhaps there is something that could be interpreted as underbreeches, because normally when you have such a big collection of clothes that basically change owner, there is some written record of that. Like these clothes must have been pretty expensive in the 16th century. Like there is a lot of velvet, there's a lot of silk, and whoever owned this didn't give it away without a reason. Like it was stored in the Einbeck City Hall for centuries, and the theory is that Erich II gave it away in exchange for a loan. So he needed money. So he gave away some of his personal wardrobe and got some money. Then he died in Venice some years later and never got his clothes back.
Yeah. So
So
this is collateral. This is his this collateral for the loan. Okay.
yeah. So that's the story that floats around, basically. I don't know if it's true. We can't prove it. It would fit the time, like the clothing looks second half of the 16th century. That works. But, and I mean, it makes sense that if he needs to give the city something in exchange for money, that it needs to be expensive. Like they don't want his underwear, they don't want his linen shirts, they want the Pluderhosen, they want the velvet doublet, because that is actually something they can sell if they don't get their money back.
Right. It's valuable.
Yeah, so that would kind of fit, and perhaps there are records somewhere in Einbeck, but we didn't ask them yet. and we still have our hands full with the Moritz project. So I hope that there will be some Einbeck project in the future, that we will be able to do the same extensive work we're doing with Moritz right now, that we can do that with the Einbeck collection, and that I can look at the other garments. But for now, I'm already pretty happy with the view I had, like with the experience with the Pluderhosen.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us on the Modern Maker podcast. I'm Mathew Gnagy.
I'm Yannick Prüser, and see you next time.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.